The cameras were already rolling, the debate hall humming like a restless beehive. The stage lights painted everything in a bright, almost surgical glow, catching every flicker of an eyebrow, every twitch of a smile. And then, it happened. Christie leaned forward, his voice carrying that familiar weight of someone used to commanding rooms, someone convinced that the next words he spoke would shut the conversation down. The audience, half leaning in, half scrolling through their phones, barely registered the subtle shift in the air. But Jasmine Crockett did. The exchange started like any other political sparring match. A question about policy, redirected into a jab, then a taunt dressed up as a clever observation. Christie smirked. A few people in the crowd chuckled, not because it was funny, but because they knew they were supposed to. It was politics as usual. Fast, sharp, sometimes cruel, rarely meaningful. But this time, it was different. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't scramble for talking points or scan her memory for a rehearsed comeback. She just stood there still, composed, like a storm gathering strength in absolute silence. The air seemed to tighten around her. Even Christie, for a fraction of a second, noticed. And then, like a perfectly aimed arrow cutting through weeks of noise, she delivered the line. One sentence, short, surgical, devastating. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical, but the effect? Instantaneous. The hall, just moments ago a swirl of murmurs, froze. A collective gasp rippled across the audience like a wave breaking all at once. Even those glued to their screens at home found themselves sitting upright. Christie blinked, his smirk faltering like a stage light losing power. He opened his mouth, searching for a retort, but nothing came. Not a word, not even a stutter. The political heavyweight, known for his bluster and sharp elbows, was silent, stripped of his rhythm, his swagger, his momentum. What Crockett had just done wasn't simply winning a debate point. It was bigger than that. It was the political equivalent of a pin drop in a crowded room, the kind of moment that stops people mid-sentence, forces them to rewatch the clip, then rewatch it again just to confirm what they saw. A single, precise strike that shattered an opponent's armor without ever raising her voice. In the control rooms of cable networks, producers leaned toward their monitors. Twitter, or what was still being called Twitter by some, lit up like a lightning storm. Journalists who had spent the night yawning through predictable exchanges suddenly found their fingers racing across keyboards. They knew this wasn't just a good moment, this was the moment. But how this one flash of brilliance came to define an entire night of political theater is a story you'll never forget. Hours before the first shot was ever fired, the room was already pulsing with an invisible charge. The debate hall wasn't just a venue, it felt like an arena. Security had swept the aisles, journalists had staked out prime positions, and the crowd, a careful mix of party loyalists, students, donors, and the politically curious, buzzed with a kind of anxious excitement. Everyone knew sparks could fly. No one knew where the first one would land. On stage, podiums stood like soldiers at attention, waiting to hold the weight of carefully crafted words, or careless ones that would ripple like earthquakes. The backdrop glowed with patriotic blue and red, polished but sterile. A silent witness to yet another night where reputations could rise or crumble before a single commercial break. Christie entered the hall like a man used to owning the room. He walked with the loose confidence of someone who'd been here before, who knew how to turn a phrase into a weapon and a smile into a shield. He joked with a staffer, smirked at a camera he knew was pointed his way, and checked his watch like he was already bored of waiting. The performance had begun long before the first question. Jasmine Crockett, by contrast, carried a different kind of energy, quieter, more deliberate. She didn't waste gestures or words. She spoke to a handful of people backstage, nodded politely, then positioned herself at her podium as though it were a place of work, not theater. There was no need to take up more space than she already did. Her strength didn't come from volume, it came from presence. From the first question, there was a rhythm: policy, rebuttal, jab, laughter, applause, repeat. The audience warmed, then cooled, like waves on a shore. Somewhere between discussions of budgets and borders, a subtle shift occurred. Christie's tone sharpened. His eyes flicked toward Crockett more often, his lines aimed less at ideas and more at her personally. He was probing for a weakness, a stumble, a soundbite to pin on her for the rest of the night. Each exchange tightened the coil. Crockett answered with precision, never rising to the bait. Christie leaned harder, pressing, dismissing, painting her positions with a broad brush meant to make them look foolish. The audience laughed where they were cued to laugh, clapped where they were meant to clap. But even in that theater, a small tremor of discomfort began to hum. They weren't just witnessing a debate, they were watching a collision in slow motion. And then Christie crossed a line. Not shouted, not vulgar, but laced with a condescension so sharp it cut through the scripted politeness like glass. A taunt disguised as a question. A smirk riding shotgun with arrogance. That was the spark. It didn't explode immediately. It hovered, like the smell of ozone before a storm, daring someone to notice, daring someone to respond. Crockett noticed. Her silence wasn't retreat. It was preparation. The question floated across the stage like so many before it. Neutral, almost bland. It wasn't the question that mattered. It was what Christie did with it. He adjusted the mic, that tiny, meaningless gesture that suddenly felt like a prelude, and leaned in. His eyes narrowed, not in thought, but in calculation. The grin he flashed wasn't friendly. It was the grin of a man who had found what he thought was a soft spot in the armor. Christie began slowly, carefully, laying out a series of facts in a way that felt less like analysis and more like a trap being baited. The words dripped with a kind of faux civility, wrapped in humor, delivered with a chuckle meant to make the audience feel in on the joke. But underneath, there was something sharper. His tone flattened Crockett's points into caricatures, turning nuance into targets, then shooting at those targets with a smirk. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He wielded sarcasm like a hammer disguised as a scalpel. Each pause wasn't for breath, it was for effect, letting the sneer linger just long enough for it to sting before the next blow landed. The crowd followed his lead at first. A few laughs, scattered applause. It was safe to laugh. Christie had given them permission. It felt like watching a heavyweight throw jabs, each one landing just hard enough to leave a mark, but not enough to draw blood. The moderators glanced at one another, unsure if they should step in or let the spectacle run. What made it ugly wasn't volume or profanity. It was the precision of the disrespect. Christie framed Crockett's ideas not as wrong, but as ridiculous. Her perspective not as misguided, but as irrelevant. He wasn't debating. He was dismissing. He wasn't arguing policy. He was undermining personhood. For a moment, it worked. Crockett didn't immediately respond. She didn't interject or roll her eyes. She let him talk, and talk, and talk. Each word he added became another rung on a ladder he didn't realize he was climbing, a ladder leading nowhere safe. By the time Christie delivered his final jab, the room had tilted. Some audience members looked at Crockett with a flicker of expectation. Would she laugh it off? Would she push back? Would she falter? He stood there, chin high, waiting for the applause to die down, certain he'd set the tone for the rest of the night. He believed he had seized the upper hand, that the cameras would replay his lines as the defining sound bites of the evening. He didn't know he'd just walked into his own undoing, because the silence that followed wasn't surrender. It was the sound of a storm gathering. Time has a strange way of stretching in moments that matter. What was only a handful of seconds on the clock felt like a slow, deliberate inhale of an entire room. The moderators glanced toward Jasmine Crockett, half expecting the usual reflex, a rushed counter, a volley of statistics, maybe even a sharp-edged quip thrown back across the podiums like a dart. But she didn't move. She stood perfectly still, eyes locked, not on the cameras, not on the audience, but on Christie himself. It wasn't defiance that filled her posture. It was something quieter, something heavier, composure that radiated like heat from asphalt on a summer day. You could almost hear it, the collective recognition that someone was not just ready to respond, they were ready to end a conversation. A faint smile flickered, the kind that wasn't for anyone watching, but for herself, like a private reminder of a truth she'd been carrying all night. Her hands rested on the podium, fingers relaxed, knuckles soft. No defensive gestures, no signs of nerves. Crockett wasn't retreating into silence, she was building it like a weapon. In the seats, people started to lean forward. Phones were raised, not because anything had happened yet, but because something was about to. Every instinct in the room screamed it. That heavy, motionless quiet wasn't empty, it was loaded. Christie, for his part, seemed to misread it. He mistook stillness for hesitation, the pause for uncertainty. He let his shoulders loosen, a half-smile stretching wider, as if he'd punctured the air and won. He even chuckled, muttering a few unscripted words under his breath, throwing one last log onto a fire he didn't realize was about to engulf him. And still, Crockett said nothing. Not yet. Because timing is everything. In politics, in boxing, in every arena where a single moment can rewrite the score, it's not the size of the punch, it's when you throw it. And Crockett was timing it like a surgeon watches a heartbeat, like a musician counts the beat before a drop that sends a crowd screaming. She drew a breath. Slow. Unhurried. Not the sharp inhale of someone about to fight, but the deliberate intake of someone about to land a truth so clean it couldn't be dodged. And then, just barely, she tilted her head. Not a big gesture, but enough to signal a shift. Enough for cameras to catch, for the audience to sense that the floor beneath them was about to move. No one coughed. No one whispered. Even the moderators froze, half aware they were standing at the edge of a moment they didn't want to ruin. The silence had done its job. The storm wasn't coming.